In the summer of 2012, the two brothers woke before sunrise, the way they always did when something felt like an adventure. They were close in age, bonded by years of shared mischief, endless fishing trips, and the kind of trust that only siblings who grew up side by side could ever understand. That morning, they packed up their truck with gear, an inflatable raft, paddles, a cooler, and a few bags of food. They had chosen a stretch of river that locals respected and feared in equal measure. It was beautiful, but unpredictable, a place where the current ran faster than it looked, and where entire sections twisted into dangerous bends. They told their parents they'd be back before nightfall on Sunday. They never came home. When hours slipped by without a call, their mother assumed it was just a delay. She cooked dinner, left the porch light on, and waited. By midnight, worry crept in. By morning, the family was frantic. They drove to the river's edge, following the same gravel road the brothers had taken less than 24 hours before. At the launch site, they found the truck parked neatly, as if nothing was wrong. The keys were gone. The raft, the gear, the brothers themselves, they had all vanished. What was supposed to be a simple weekend escape now looked like the beginning of something unexplainable. The father dialed authorities, his voice shaking as he tried to explain that his sons were missing. Deputies arrived within the hour, surveying the truck and noting that it didn't appear tampered with. The windows were rolled up, the doors locked, and inside sat the brothers' spare clothes and a half-empty gas receipt. It looked like they had carried everything they needed onto the raft and set out without issue. But when officers followed the bank downstream, expecting to find at least some trace of them, a paddle, a cooler, even boot prints in the mud, there was nothing. The river stretched wide and cold, its surface calm and deceptive, but the undertow was known to pull under anything unlucky enough to fall into its grip. By late afternoon, word spread across town. The brothers were well known, and the idea of them being in trouble sparked immediate concern. Friends and extended family gathered at the river, their voices cutting through the trees as they shouted their names again and again. Search and rescue teams were mobilized. Within hours, helicopters hovered low over the current, their rotors shaking the water as spotters leaned out. Scanning for the faintest sign of movement, boats crisscrossed the river with floodlights as dusk fell, the beams cutting through the darkness in desperate sweeps. Still, the water gave nothing back. As the first night passed, hope mixed uneasily with dread. Authorities interviewed anyone who had seen the brothers that morning. A convenience store clerk remembered them buying ice and bottled water. A fisherman thought he saw their raft near the bend mid-afternoon, though he couldn't be certain. Their timeline seemed solid. They had launched, paddled downstream, and then disappeared into the heart of the river. For the family, that uncertainty was unbearable. Every unanswered question seemed heavier than the last. Had they capsized? Were they stranded somewhere downstream, waiting to be found? Or had something more sinister happened that no one could yet explain? The following day, rescuers expanded their search, moving miles downstream, probing every snag of driftwood, every eddy and whirlpool where debris might have collected. The river, swollen from earlier rains, was colder than expected and carried a force beneath the surface that no one could predict. Divers went in, weighted down by their own gear, but the current tossed them like leaves. They emerged shivering, shaken by what lay beneath, a twisting maze of logs, rocks, and hidden caverns where the water rushed violently before vanishing into blackness. It was the kind of place where something could disappear in seconds and never come back up. At the truck, the mother sat in silence, clutching one of her son's jackets she had found folded behind the seat. Her eyes stayed fixed on the water as if sheer willpower might force the river to give them back. By evening, neighbors began bringing food, offering words of comfort that sounded hollow, even as they were spoken. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but the river had a reputation. Everyone in town knew stories of people who had gone in and never come back out. The fact that two brothers, strong swimmers and outdoorsmen, had vanished together made it even more devastating. As the second night closed in, officers called the family together. They promised to continue the search, but they cautioned that the first 48 hours were critical. Beyond that, survival was unlikely. The words landed like stones, heavy and unforgiving, and the family braced themselves against the truth they didn't want to face. Still, denial clung to them. These weren't reckless boys, they insisted. They were careful, experienced, and above all, they had each other. It wasn't possible for them both to be gone. When darkness swallowed the river that night, the current seemed almost louder, as if reminding everyone how easily they could erase a life. The search was far from over, but for the first time, those who stood along the banks felt something they hadn't dared to admit before: the creeping suspicion that the brothers hadn't just been delayed. They had been taken, by water, by fate, or by something still unseen, and the river wasn't finished keeping its secrets. By the third day, the river had become a staging ground for desperation. Patrol cars lined the gravel access road, red and blue lights flickering against the trees while the low thrum of helicopter blades beat overhead. Rescue crews worked in shifts, exhausted but relentless, combing through every bend of water, every tangle of driftwood. Search dogs trotted along the banks, their handlers calling commands into radios, while families of volunteers trudged along muddy trails, scanning the current for anything: a piece of clothing, the edge of a raft, the ripple of movement beneath the surface. The first breakthrough came in the form of something small. A volunteer, wading through reeds at the river's edge, pulled up a plastic water bottle lodged against a rock. The label was smeared, but inside was a faint mark of permanent ink, one of the brothers' initials. Hours later, a torn glove was recovered several miles downstream. It was wet, worn at the fingertips, and stretched as though it had been ripped off in a struggle. The discoveries should have been answers, but they only deepened the mystery. Neither item explained how both men could vanish without a trace, leaving only fragments of their presence behind. Divers were the next to try. Strapping on tanks and weighted belts, they descended into water so murky that visibility vanished after only a few feet. Below the surface, the current fought them violently, dragging at their equipment, pushing them into jagged rocks and gnarled tree trunks hidden beneath the silt. What little they saw was like a maze: caverns carved by centuries of rushing water, chambers large enough to swallow a raft whole, narrow cracks that could trap anything unlucky enough to be pulled inside. Each dive lasted only minutes, the men surfacing gasping, their faces pale with what they had felt more than seen. They spoke of darkness that pressed in on all sides, of powerful surges that threatened to pin them in place. If the brothers had gone under here, the chances of recovery were slim to none. Helicopters swept the skies above, circling low as spotters peered out with binoculars. From that height, the river looked deceptively peaceful, silver ribbons curling around stones and sandbars. But even from the air, no signs of the raft appeared. Searchers expanded farther downstream, scanning where the current widened and slowed, hoping debris might have been carried there. Still, the water offered nothing more than false hope. Back on land, the brothers' family clung to the sidelines, waiting with a patience that was both forced and fragile. Each new item recovered was brought to them for confirmation. The mother cradled the torn glove in her lap, insisting it wasn't her son's until she recognized the stitching along the palm. She broke down then, tears blurring her voice as she admitted it was his. For the father, the water bottle was the worst. He remembered watching his son mark it with a black pen just days before the trip. Holding it now felt like holding a ghost. Authorities gathered the family for updates each evening, explaining procedures with words that landed heavy and cold. They described sonar scans, underwater cameras, and grid searches marked out with GPS, but each briefing ended the same: no bodies, no raft, no definitive answers. The lead investigator began voicing what others had only whispered: that the river may have claimed them, pulling them beneath the surface where no search team could ever reach. The family bristled at the suggestion, refusing to accept that both brothers could simply disappear without leaving anything more than a glove and a bottle. As the week dragged on, tensions mounted. Rescuers debated strategy. Some insisted the river was the only explanation, while others pushed to investigate whether foul play was involved. Had the brothers even made it far downstream? Could they have been intercepted before the water took them? Rumors crept into conversations among volunteers, each theory darker than the last. But the evidence kept pointing back to the current. Day after day, the search produced nothing but silence. By the 8th day, exhaustion was setting in. Helicopters were pulled back, their fuel budgets depleted. Volunteer numbers dwindled as people returned to jobs and obligations, leaving behind only the core rescue team and the grieving family. Divers still went in, but each attempt seemed more hopeless than the last. The river wasn't giving them back. On the 9th night, as floodlights illuminated the water and crews packed their equipment, the mother whispered that she could still feel her sons alive somewhere. Her words hung in the heavy summer air, clashing with the cold assessments of the investigators. For officials, the likelihood of survival had already passed. For her, denial was the only lifeline left, and so the search pressed on, not out of optimism but out of duty, as the river flowed silently, guarding its secrets while the family clung to the fading hope that something more than scattered belongings would surface. The river had always carried a certain weight in local memory, a reputation built not just on beauty, but on danger. To those who had grown up along its banks, it was a place of contradictions, serene on the surface, yet hiding unpredictable violence beneath. Investigators looking into the brothers' disappearance quickly realized they weren't the first to vanish here. Old case files painted a grim pattern. Over the past 3 decades, at least a dozen lives had been lost in the same waters, many never recovered. Some were swimmers caught in whirlpools that spun silently until they dragged a body under. Others were rafters and kayakers swept into logjams so tight that even the strongest divers couldn't pry them loose. A few were simply listed as presumed drowned, their bodies never found at all. Locals told these stories with the quiet certainty of experience. A fisherman recalled a friend who had gone missing in the late 90s. His boat found drifting, but his body never surfacing. Another spoke of a teenage girl swept under near the same bend where the brothers had been seen, her body located weeks later nearly 10 miles downstream. There was an unspoken understanding here. Once the river decided to take something, it rarely gave it back. For the search teams, these accounts confirmed what the evidence already suggested. The brothers may have been pulled into one of the river's hidden chambers, trapped where no one could follow. But as investigators canvassed the community, darker whispers began to surface. Not everyone was convinced the river alone was responsible. Some wondered if the brothers had underestimated its strength, ignoring warnings in their excitement for adventure. Others raised possibilities that reached beyond accident. At the diner where their family often ate breakfast, locals debated whether the brothers might have run from debts. Rumors swirled of money owed, of quiet arguments overheard. A few even suggested the raft had been tampered with, that someone had ensured their journey would end in disaster. These theories carried little evidence, but once spoken aloud, they lingered like shadows. Detectives entertained the possibilities, if only to rule them out. They interviewed friends, employers, and anyone who might know of disputes the brothers had. Nothing substantial emerged. No criminal record, no history of violence, no debts that suggested desperation. What they found instead was a portrait of 2 ordinary men chasing adventure, neither reckless nor naive. Still, the idea of foul play refused to die, fueled by the lack of bodies and the eerie silence of the river. To some, it seemed too convenient that both brothers could vanish without trace, as though they had been swallowed not by water, but by intent. Meanwhile, the family wrestled with these narratives in private. The father grew angry at the whispers, furious that strangers would suggest his sons abandon their lives. The mother refused even to acknowledge the rumors, clinging to the belief that her boys had been victims of nature, not their own choices. Every speculative headline in the local paper cut deeper, forcing them to live not only with absence, but with suspicion. For them, there was no comfort in theories, only pain. Investigators returned again and again to the geography of the river. The section where the brothers launched was notorious among first responders. Beneath the calm surface, the current split into hidden channels, some feeding into sinkholes so deep they resembled caves. One diver described it as a labyrinth, water rushing in every direction at once, sucking anything loose into chambers that twisted out of sight. If the raft had flipped there, survival would have been nearly impossible. The fact that pieces of gear had surfaced only confirmed how powerful the currents could be. Items light enough to break free drifted downstream, while anything heavier was likely pinned far below. Still, questions lingered. Why had no larger parts of the raft surfaced? Why no trace of their bodies when other victims had eventually been recovered? Search teams pressed farther downstream, hoping the river had carried them farther than expected. Each new day ended in disappointment. The river gave up no more clues, feeding doubts and keeping speculation alive. By the third week, the case had become a community obsession. Neighbors debated theories at gas stations and grocery store aisles, choosing sides between accident and conspiracy. Some clung to the belief that the brothers had drowned, lost like so many before them. Others whispered that something human, not natural, had silenced them. What no one could deny was the river's hold, its history of taking lives, its power to erase evidence, and now its role at the center of a mystery that only deepened with time. For investigators, every path led back to the same grim reality. Without bodies, they had no proof, no closure, no certainty. And with each passing day, the weight of the river's reputation grew heavier, pressing down on everyone who stood along its banks. The brothers had joined a list of names whispered in fear, reminders that this water did not forgive mistakes, and that sometimes it didn't forgive at all. In the weeks after the brothers vanished, the riverbanks turned from a place of frantic search into a stage for rumors and restless hope. With no bodies and no raft, the absence left a void that the community rushed to fill with speculation. Sightings began to trickle in, each one carrying the weight of possibility. A fisherman swore he had seen two men moving along the bank just days after the disappearance. He described them as tired-looking, clothes damp, trudging toward the tree line as if trying to avoid notice. Investigators followed his account, combing the stretch of shoreline he indicated. They found boot tracks, but recent storms had left the mud too churned to match definitively. What could have been a breakthrough dissolved into ambiguity. Days later, another lead emerged from a roadside motel an hour away. A clerk recalled two men who checked in late one night paying cash, their clothes rumpled and their behavior nervous. The description sounded close enough to the brothers that authorities rushed to review the motel's surveillance tapes. But when the grainy footage was examined, the shapes of the men were indistinct. Their faces, blurred by poor resolution in the angle of the camera, could have belonged to anyone. The room they occupied was searched, but no belongings were left behind, no fingerprints matched, no trace of the brothers was confirmed. Like the fisherman's testimony, this clue collapsed under the weight of doubt. More reports followed. Two men hitchhiking near a county road, a pair of figures spotted at a gas station, strangers seen walking into the woods at dusk. Each claim carried urgency at first, filling the family with a fragile hope. But every time investigators pressed further, they found cracks in the accounts. Timelines didn't match, descriptions faltered, witnesses contradicted themselves under questioning. By the end of each pursuit, the leads dissolved like smoke, leaving nothing solid to hold on to. The endless cycle of possibility and disappointment began to fracture the investigation. Detectives were split in their approach. Some clung to the accident theory, pointing to the evidence already gathered, the torn glove, the water bottle, the dangerous currents. To them, every failed lead only reinforced the river's guilt. Others pushed for broader inquiry, unsettled by the lack of bodies. They wondered aloud whether the brothers had staged their disappearance, whether they had debts, troubles, or secrets strong enough to make them abandon their lives. If that was the case, the sightings might not be coincidences at all, but glimpses of men who no longer wanted to be found. For the family, the tension was unbearable. Each new rumor swung their emotions violently, raising hope only to crush it. The mother clung to every report of a sighting, convinced her sons were still alive, trying to find a way back. The father grew hardened, dismissing the accounts as wishful thinking or outright lies. Arguments erupted at their kitchen table late into the night, fueled by grief, exhaustion, and the gnawing absence of truth. To them, the silence of the river had been cruel, but the false hope of strangers felt even crueler. By the fourth week, the investigation had slowed. Media attention waned, headlines shifted to other stories, and volunteers who had once crowded the banks began to drift away. Search crews still patrolled, but their presence felt more like routine than urgency. The flood of tips dwindled to a trickle, and the once constant phone calls to the sheriff's office began to taper off. Each unanswered question became heavier, settling into the weight of an unsolved mystery. Frustration seeped into every corner of the case. Detectives reviewed evidence again and again, trying to reconcile the impossibility of two men vanishing without trace. Meetings dragged on with no progress. Theories were debated, then discarded, leaving behind only the same conclusions they had started with: accident, choice, or foul play. None could be proven. The family's appeals for information grew quieter, their voices strained and weary. Even the community, once electrified by the drama, began to speak of the brothers' disappearance in the past tense. By the end of the second month, investigators stood at a wall they couldn't scale. The fisherman's testimony, the motel clerk's certainty, the hitchhiker sightings, all of it had collapsed under scrutiny, leaving nothing but shadows. The case file thickened with reports, yet none offered resolution. And so the story of the brothers began to slip from the front page into the cold archives of memory, where unanswered questions festered and speculation lingered. What had started as a frantic search now hovered in limbo, caught between accident and intention, with no way to prove either. And as the river flowed on, silent and steady, it seemed to mock the investigators with its indifference. Somewhere within its depths or beyond its banks lay the truth, but for now all anyone had were fragments, rumors, and the unbearable silence of leads that led nowhere. The official stance came quietly, almost without ceremony. Weeks of failed searches had worn down the investigators, and by the start of the third month, the sheriff's office released a statement that the brothers had most likely drowned. No bodies, no raft, no proof, but the logic was all they had. The family read the words and rejected them outright. To declare the boys gone without answers felt like surrender, and surrender was something they could not allow themselves to do. Their home became a place suspended in two realities. In the kitchen, their mother clung to photographs, poring over them as though they might reveal something she had missed. A detail in their clothes, a mark on their skin, any clue pointing to survival. She planned vigils by the river, lighting candles at dusk and asking neighbors to stand with her in silence. At each gathering, she whispered prayers into the current, promising her sons that she would never give up. Their father, meanwhile, sat in the next room, staring at nothing, convinced that the truth was simpler and far darker. To him, the river had taken them, and hope was just another way of prolonging pain. The disagreements grew louder as days passed. She insisted they were still out there, maybe injured, maybe lost, maybe hiding from something larger than anyone knew. He countered with facts: the gear that had been found, the histories of others lost to the same waters, the sheer impossibility of two men vanishing on land without anyone helping them. Their arguments went late into the night, doors slammed, voices cracked, and the grief that bound them also began to divide them. The brothers' absence didn't just hollow out their lives, it carved a rift into the family itself. Birthdays became unbearable rituals. When the first one arrived after the disappearance, a cake was baked, but never cut. The chairs around the table were set for everyone, but two remained empty, their silence heavier than the words spoken around them. Relatives gathered, trying to be supportive, but the atmosphere was fractured. Some joined the mother in clinging to the belief that the brothers might still walk through the door, while others quietly sided with the father, urging her to face reality. Each year afterward replayed the same scene: candles lit, empty chairs untouched, and tears shed in private when the night ended. Their sister, caught between two grieving parents, struggled with her own beliefs. At times she leaned toward her father's acceptance, seeing how the endless waiting corroded her mother's spirit. At other times, she felt her mother's conviction like a lifeline, refusing to abandon her brothers to the river's silence. For her, it wasn't just about truth, but about survival, choosing which story hurt less to believe. Friends noticed her growing quiet, drifting away from gatherings, unable to laugh the way she once did. In her silence, she carried both sides of the family's fractured hope. The vigils along the river became smaller over time, but no less desperate. In the first months, dozens gathered, holding candles that flickered against the current, Strangers joined, touched by the tragedy, adding flowers and handwritten notes to the water's edge. But as seasons turned, the numbers dwindled, leaving mostly family members huddled against the cold, whispering prayers into the night. For the mother, each vigil was a declaration. Her sons were not forgotten, not abandoned, and not lost to her heart. For the father, the vigils felt like reopening a wound that had already cut him to the bone. He went less often, preferring to sit alone in the dark, mourning in silence. The family split into camps that hardened with time, denial on one side, acceptance on the other. Cousins, uncles, and grandparents took sides gently, some speaking of the boys in the present tense, others in the past. The arguments at family gatherings grew sharper. Accusations surfaced, unspoken guilt about what might have been done differently, who should have stopped them from taking the trip, who failed to search hard enough when it mattered most. Grief turned inward, pitting them against one another even as it bound them together in loss. For investigators, the family's refusal to agree on what had happened mirrored the broader community's divide. Some people whispered that the boys had drowned, plain and simple. Others kept insisting something darker was at play. The absence of proof meant both sides could hold their beliefs without being challenged by evidence, and so the silence grew heavier with every passing month. At home, the mother kept the brothers' room exactly as they had left it, beds made, clothes folded, posters still hanging on the walls. She refused to box up anything, as though doing so would mean admitting they weren't coming back. The father avoided the room altogether, his footsteps halting at the threshold before retreating down the hall. Each night, the house carried a stillness that felt less like peace and more like waiting. Years would pass before any new clues surfaced, but in those first seasons after the disappearance, the family lived in a limbo that felt endless. Hope clashed with despair, denial with acceptance, and the river remained the silent witness to it all. No matter how fiercely they argued, no matter how hard they tried to hold on, the truth was the same. The boys were gone, and nothing could bring them back. Not yet. Time did not heal the wound, it only deepened it. As the years stretched on, the brothers' disappearance slipped from urgent investigation into something else entirely, a story retold in fragments, each version softer and more uncertain than the last. The official search had ended long ago, but the river remained unchanged, flowing past with the same indifference it always had. What once was a frantic community effort became a ghost story whispered along its banks. Hikers pointed toward the bend in the current and told newcomers of the two brothers who had gone out and never returned, swallowed whole by water that never gave them back. Occasionally, volunteers returned, stubborn in their refusal to let the case fade completely. Divers with new equipment tested their luck in the same unforgiving currents. Sonar was dragged across the riverbed, promising clearer images than had been possible a decade earlier. Each attempt carried the fragile hope of discovery, but nothing was ever found. The depths remained silent, concealing whatever truths had been locked beneath since that summer in 2012. For those who risked themselves to search, the frustration was crushing. Each dive ended in murk, each scan returned shadows, each trip ended with nothing but exhaustion. The press, once relentless in its coverage, drifted away within the first 2 years. Headlines that had screamed about the vanishing of 2 young men now gave way to fresher tragedies, newer mysteries. By the 5th year, their story was mentioned only in brief anniversary pieces, short columns tucked between larger articles. By the 10th, it was reduced to a paragraph in retrospectives about unsolved local cases. For the wider world, their absence became little more than a cautionary tale, another warning about the dangers of underestimating the river. But for the family, time never dulled the ache. Their mother kept the search alive in ways the authorities no longer could. She posted online appeals, updating forums and social media pages dedicated to missing persons. She reached out to strangers, hoping someone, somewhere, might have seen something overlooked. Each message carried the same plea: don't forget them. In her posts, she wrote as if her sons might still be alive, as if the internet could bridge the impossible gap that years had carved. The responses were kind but repetitive: prayers, sympathy, and the occasional false lead that reignited hope before collapsing under scrutiny. The father withdrew in the opposite direction. Where his wife sought answers, he chose silence. He stopped attending vigils after the 5th year, claiming the repetition was too much to bear. Friends noticed he spoke less about his sons, referring to them only when pressed. Some mistook his quiet for acceptance, but in truth, it was a kind of surrender, a way to carry grief without being crushed by it. The marriage strained under the divide, each parent grieving in a way the other could not understand. What had once been arguments became long silences, broken only by the rituals of daily life. The siblings, grown now with families of their own, carried the weight in quieter ways. They kept the brothers' photos framed in their homes, told their children about uncles they would never meet. The story became part of their identity, something they explained carefully when asked about family history. To them, the disappearance was less an open case and more a scar, visible, permanent, shaping everything around it. By 2023, 11 years had passed since the day the brothers vanished. In the town, their names lingered in memory but without urgency, woven into the fabric of local folklore. The river was still spoken of as dangerous, a place where people vanished, but the brothers' story was now just one of many. For strangers moving into the area, it was told like a legend. 2 young men lost to the current, never seen again, their bodies hidden somewhere in the depths. Yet for their family, the loss was not a story but a wound that never healed. Every holiday carried their absence. Every milestone, weddings, births, graduations, was shadowed by the missing seats where they should have been. 11 years of silence had not erased the questions, it had only sharpened them. Were they trapped beneath the river's surface all this time, or had something else entirely stolen them away? The answers remained buried, frozen as if time itself had stopped the moment they launched their raft. And as the family marked another year without them, the silence of the case hung heavier than ever. No evidence, no resolution, no peace, just a river that moved steadily forward while the lives of those left behind remained anchored in the same unbearable question: how could 2 brothers vanish without a trace? In the summer of 2023, the river that had long been feared and respected was no longer the same. A brutal drought stretched across the region, drying up farmland, emptying reservoirs, and turning once powerful waterways into sluggish shadows of themselves. The river, the very place that had stolen the brothers 11 years earlier, fell to its lowest level in decades. Banks that had always been submerged now stood exposed, cracked with sun, littered with driftwood that hadn't seen air in generations. What had once been a wide, surging current shrank into narrow channels that wound around stretches of mud and rock, revealing scars of a landscape usually hidden. To those who had lived near it all their lives, the transformation was unsettling. Hikers and fishermen who had walked these banks countless times found themselves staring at terrain they had never imagined existed. Jagged stones jutted from the mud like broken teeth, while hollowed pockets of earth resembled empty wells, remnants of whirlpools now stripped bare. The air carried a strange heaviness, the smell of stagnant water rising where the flow had slowed to a crawl. For many, it was eerie to see the river laid bare, as if the drought had peeled away its secrets one layer at a time. It wasn't long before people began to notice things protruding from the exposed beds, shapes that didn't belong among the rocks and branches. A fisherman spotted the first, what looked like twisted metal glinting in the sun. At first he thought it was scrap, maybe part of an old barrel or farming equipment washed downstream. But when he walked closer, he saw ropes tangled through it, hardened and blackened by years underwater. He called the sheriff's office, not yet sure what he had found, but uneasy enough to know it deserved attention. Word traveled quickly, and soon hikers came forward with their own discoveries. A hiker climbing over the cracked mud near a dried channel reported something that looked like the corner of a frame, fabric clinging to it in shreds. Another man swore he saw bones, though when officials arrived, they turned out to be the remains of an animal. Each sighting carried with it the same shiver of possibility. For years, the river had hidden what happened to the brothers. Now, with its body shrinking, people wondered if the drought was finally forcing the water to speak. Authorities were cautious at first. They had been called out for false alarms before, especially in a case that had long since turned into local legend. But when deputies arrived at the site of the fisherman's discovery, They were struck by what they saw. Half buried in mud, trapped between exposed boulders, was a warped piece of metal that looked strikingly out of place in a riverbed. On closer inspection, it was clear that it was not junk. It was part of a frame, bent and crushed by years of pressure. The ropes weren't just tangled debris. They were the remains of thick lines, the kind often used to lash gear to rafts. The find spread quickly through the community, and the family was notified almost immediately. For them, the drought was more than a climate disaster. It was an opening, a chance to finally learn what had been denied to them for over a decade. They stood on the bank as deputies marked the site, watching in silence as officials worked to free the object from the muck. Reporters returned as well, their cameras capturing images of the exposed bed, the twisted metal, and the quiet intensity of a family on the edge of an answer. The atmosphere was heavy, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. No one wanted to say aloud what they were thinking, but the thought was inescapable. If the river had held their sons all this time, then the drought might be the one force capable of revealing them. Each unusual shape spotted along the bank now felt ominous, each protrusion in the mud a potential piece of the puzzle. In town, conversations shifted. People who had once dismissed the case as a tragic accident now speculated with renewed urgency. Theories resurfaced. Old suspicions rekindled. Some said this was proof the brothers had never left the water, that the accident theory had always been correct. Others wondered if something more sinister had been hidden under the currents all along. Whatever the truth was, it was no longer buried beyond reach. The river had changed, and with it, the silence that had held for 11 years began to fracture. By the end of that summer, the drought showed no signs of breaking. Each week the waterline sank lower, peeling back more of the river's skin, and with every new reveal came the sense that the story was about to change forever. The river, once untouchable, had been weakened by time and nature, and now, piece by piece, it was beginning to give up its secrets. The call came in on a humid August morning. A hiker had reported seeing what looked like a raft wedged between two boulders in a section of river now drained to a trickle. At first, deputies assumed it would be another false alarm, another case of driftwood mistaken for something more. But when the first responders arrived and looked down into the cracked bed, their radios grew quiet. Half buried in mud and silt, its shape warped by years of pressure, was a metallic frame that clearly didn't belong in the river's natural debris. The ropes that hung from it were thick, the kind used for lashing down supplies, now hardened into blackened cords that looked fossilized. It was not junk, it was a raft, or what was left of one. Crews moved quickly to cordon off the area. Investigators descended into the mud, boots sinking with every step, and began the delicate process of clearing silt with shovels and brushes. Bit by bit, the twisted frame came into focus, a collapsed skeleton of aluminum tubing and frayed canvas, folded in on itself as though crushed by years of current and stone. Entangled in its remains were fragments of rope and scraps of fabric, so waterlogged they crumbled at the touch. Each piece confirmed what everyone was beginning to think, but no one wanted to say aloud. The brothers' raft had been here all along, hidden beneath the river for 11 years. Then came the moment no one could prepare for. Just a few yards downstream, as crews widened their search, a deputy spotted something pale protruding from the muck. At first, he thought it was stone, but when the mud was brushed away, the smooth arc of bone emerged. Soon, another piece surfaced, then another. By the time forensic teams arrived, it was undeniable. Skeletal remains lay scattered across the exposed bed, preserved in part by the river's cold currents. And there were two sets. The scene became methodical, clinical, but heavy with emotion. Forensic anthropologists in protective suits moved carefully, documenting every angle before extraction. Bones were lifted one by one, rinsed in clean water, and placed into sterile containers. Alongside them, small personal artifacts were recovered: rusted clips, a torn strap buckle, fragments of shoe leather. Each object was catalogued, bagged, and carried up the embankment under the weight of silence. For the family, watching from a distance, the sight was unbearable. For 11 years they had lived with not knowing. Now the truth was being pulled, piece by piece, from the mud at their feet. The discovery reignited the case with grim clarity. Media outlets swarmed back to the story, their cameras focused on the excavation site, broadcasting images of investigators hunched over the exposed remains. Interviews with law enforcement officials were cautious. They confirmed the recovery of a raft and human remains, but withheld speculation. Behind the measured statements, however, was an unspoken understanding. After more than a decade, the brothers had finally been found. The community reacted with a mixture of relief and sorrow. For some, it was the closure they had long assumed would never come. For others, it stirred old fears about the river's reputation, reinforcing its legacy as a place that swallowed people whole. Neighbors left flowers at the site, their petals wilting quickly in the heat, while strangers gathered to watch silently from the banks. Everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing the end of a story that had haunted the town for years. In the lab, forensic teams worked tirelessly to piece together what the river had preserved. The bones were surprisingly intact, a testament to the cold currents that had slowed decay. DNA samples were collected for confirmation, though the family's reaction left little doubt as to whose remains they were. The raft's crushed frame, twisted and broken, suggested a violent impact, though whether from rocks, current, or something else remained to be determined. The ropes tangled within it hinted at entrapment, the possibility that once the raft collapsed, the brothers had no way to free themselves. For investigators, the recovery shifted everything. For years, they had debated whether the disappearance was an accident, a choice, or something darker. Now, with physical evidence in hand, the speculation narrowed. The river had hidden the truth, not foul play or conspiracy. Yet the details still mattered, and each artifact pulled from the mud carried a clue that needed to be read carefully. As the sun dipped low that evening, crews packed the last of the evidence into vehicles, leaving behind only shallow impressions in the drying riverbed where the raft had rested for over a decade. The family lingered until the last truck pulled away, staring at the empty space as if the earth itself had opened to reveal their loss. There was no celebration, no relief, only the heavy silence of answers long delayed and grief sharpened once again by the clarity of truth. For 11 years, the river had refused to give them back. Now, exposed by drought, it had finally spoken. What it revealed was not salvation, but the undeniable evidence of what the family had feared all along. The brothers had never left the water. The confirmation came quietly, delivered in the sterile language of science, but weighted with emotion. DNA analysis left no doubt. The skeletal remains recovered from the riverbed were the missing brothers. 11 years of speculation, rumor, and fractured hope ended with a certainty that was both merciful and cruel. For the family, it was the answer they had begged for and the reality they had feared most. Their boys were not hidden somewhere starting new lives, nor taken by foul play. They had been here all along, beneath the surface, held in silence by the river that had stolen them. The raft told its own story. Forensic examiners laid out the crushed frame in a lab, studying its warped tubing and shredded fabric. The damage was not random. It bore the signature of violent impact. Sections of the aluminum frame were bent inward, as if the raft had slammed into something immovable. Specialists concluded it likely struck a submerged boulder at high speed, the kind of hazard notorious in that stretch of river. The force would have been sudden, disorienting, and devastating. In an instant, what began as a weekend adventure could have spiraled into catastrophe. Attention turned to the bones. Anthropologists handled them with precision, mapping fractures and patterns of wear. One skull bore a distinct fracture above the temple, evidence of blunt force trauma. The angle suggested the brother had been thrown forward, his head colliding with rock or frame when the raft struck. The injury was severe enough that he likely lost consciousness instantly. Forensic reconstruction pointed to drowning as the ultimate cause of death, but unconsciousness meant he never had a chance to fight the current. The second set of remains told a different but equally tragic story. Tangled fibers of rope had fused around sections of bone, a grim indication that he had been ensnared when the raft collapsed. Forensic teams theorized that in the chaos of impact, as the raft folded inward, the ropes used to lash down gear wrapped around his arms or torso. Struggling against the current, he would have been pulled beneath, pinned under the twisted frame, The evidence suggested he remained trapped until the river entombed him in its depths. Together, the two stories formed a devastatingly simple narrative. One brother rendered helpless by injury, the other caught in rope and debris, both claimed in seconds by the cold, relentless water. No foul play, no escape. Just an accident, brutal and unforgiving, sealed by the river's silence. For investigators, the findings provided closure not only for the family, but also for the case that had haunted their records for over a decade. Theories of deaths, disappearance by choice, or sabotage crumbled under the weight of evidence. The raft's crushed frame and the condition of the remains left no room for doubt. This was not a mystery of human malice, but of nature's power. The river had not conspired, it had simply taken. Yet knowing the truth did not erase the years of uncertainty. For the family, grief shifted, but did not lessen. The mother wept when told about the head injury, haunted by the image of her son unconscious in the water. The father grew quiet when shown photographs of the rope, his face hardening at the thought of his other son struggling in vain. Both deaths were accidental, but neither felt merciful. To imagine the final moments was to reopen wounds carved long ago. The community absorbed the news with solemnity. For years, the disappearance had been a ghost story, an open wound that divided belief between accident and conspiracy. Now, with facts laid bare, the town accepted the river's reputation anew. It was not mystery or myth that had taken the brothers, but the unrelenting physics of current, rock, and rope. The lesson was sobering, but it did little to ease the sadness. When the report was finalized, investigators chose their words carefully. Both deaths were accidental drownings caused by blunt force trauma and entrapment following raft collapse. The phrasing was clinical, detached, but behind the language was the undeniable truth. The brothers never had a chance. The accident was swift, and the silence that followed had stretched for 11 unbearable years. They gathered on a cool September morning, the sky washed in pale gray, as if the weather itself understood the weight of the day. The drought had stripped the river to half its usual size, exposing sandbars and cracked mud where the water once roared. It was here, at the very bend where the raft had been uncovered, that the family stood together. No cameras, no reporters, just the people who had carried the grief for more than a decade, finally brought back to the place that had defined their loss. A small table had been set near the water's edge, draped with photographs of the brothers, one smiling at a fishing dock, the other holding a paddle aloft on a camping trip. Candles flickered against the breeze, their flames wavering but stubborn, much like the family's own strength. The mother held both pictures close to her chest before placing them gently down. For years, she had prayed to see her sons' faces again. Now, the photos were all she had left to place at the river's feet. The ceremony was simple but raw. Relatives stood in a circle, heads bowed, each person saying aloud what the silence had carried for so long. The siblings spoke of birthdays with empty chairs, of holidays clouded by absence, of the strange ache of living with a wound that never healed. Their father spoke softly, his voice breaking as he admitted what he had never confessed, that he had spent years resenting the river, resenting himself for letting them go that day. Then he stopped, unable to go further, his words replaced by tears. When the mother's turn came, she stood quietly for a long moment, staring at the narrowing current. She whispered that she had always believed her sons were still alive somewhere, that her hope had been both her salvation and her torment. But with the truth laid bare, bones, raft, forensic evidence, she no longer had to imagine them lost in the world. She finally knew. They hadn't abandoned her. They hadn't run away. They had fought the river with everything they had, and the river had taken them. The acknowledgement shattered her, but it also freed her from the weight of uncertainty. A pastor led a short prayer, asking for peace for the brothers and strength for those left behind. Then the family stepped forward one by one, tossing flowers into the current. The petals drifted slowly, carried away by water that now seemed almost too calm, as though mocking the violence it had once unleashed. Each bloom moved farther downstream until they disappeared around the bend, symbols of two lives carried forward into memory. For the investigators who attended quietly at the edge of the circle, closure came in a different form. The case file that had sat unresolved for so many years could finally be marked complete. The theories, the rumors, the suspicions, all silenced by the evidence the drought had delivered. The river had hidden the truth, but nature had eventually forced it out. In its lowest, most fragile state, it had returned what it had stolen, granting the family the one thing they had pleaded for: answers. When the candles burned low and the ceremony ended, the family lingered. They touched the photographs, hugged one another, and walked slowly back to their cars. No one spoke of moving on. Such words would have felt false. What they carried now was not relief but clarity, a knowledge that hurt deeply but grounded them in reality. The waiting was over. The wondering was over. The silence of uncertainty had finally broken. As the last of them left, the river continued to run, shrunken but steady, as if nothing had changed. Yet for the family, everything had. The mystery was no longer a question passed from one year to the next. The brothers' story had ended, not with conspiracy or disappearance, but with the raw, simple truth of an accident that left 2 lives pinned beneath water and stone. Heartbreaking clarity replaced the fog of doubt, and in that clarity, in the quiet of a river finally stripped of its secrets, the family found something they had been denied for 11 long years. Not comfort, not healing, but closure, delivered not by time, not by effort, but by the drought itself, the hand of nature forcing the river to give them back.